Welcome to the Creek Road Baptist Pulpit. These weekly podcasts feature expository messages delivered to edify the soul. Now let's join Pastor Dave as he presents this week's message.
So if you take your Bible and turn with me to Luke chapter 2. Luke chapter 2. And today we're going to be in the first 7 verses. So I'm going to do a little series here because it's Advent. So I'm going to be preaching through just Luke 2. I'm just going to go from the beginning and work my way through all of Luke chapter 2. Luke chapter 2 is a long chapter. It's 52 verses long. There's a lot of material here. It's all about the Lord Jesus. And so we're just going to focus on Luke's telling of the birth and the events that happened around and after the birth. Luke chapter 2 today, verses 1 through 7, I am going to entitle my sermon, No Room, No Problem. Why don't we begin then with a reading of God's Word, and we'll beginning there in verse 1, Luke chapter 2. It came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Cæsar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And this taxing was first made when Cyrenius was governor of Syria. And all went to be taxed, every one to his own city, and Joseph also went up from Galilee, out of the city of Nazareth, into Judea, unto the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be taxed with Mary, his espoused wife, being great with child. And so it was that while they were there, the days were accomplished that she should be delivered. She brought forth her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. You notice in our reading today that there's a whole lot here about what's going on at the time. It starts with, and it came to pass in those days. It came to pass in those days. Well, there was great turmoil in those days. Great turmoil stirred the land of the Bible in the days before the birth of Christ. So leading up to this period of time, we have a lot of geopolitical, I guess maybe we could put it like that, intrigue, maybe that's kind of the kind word for it. There was a gentleman by the name of Archelaus. Now, he's not the same Archelaus that we have in Matthew's gospel. In Matthew's gospel, the Archelaus that's mentioned there was a son of Herod. This is not a son of Herod. This is before that. So Archelaus, he was the Roman governor over Judea and Samaria, and he was very corrupt. He accused, get this is the first on the hit parade of Archelaus. He accused the high priest of sedition against Rome, had him removed, and replaced him with his own brother. Nepotism and politics replaced heaven's order in the house of God, and nepotism and politics is still the order of our day. Archelaus spent lavishly to beautify the palace at Jericho. Now remember, this is a ruler, a politician, if you will. Where's he getting his money from? Is it his money? No, it's the people's money. So he's taxing the people to make enough money so that he can make his retreat beautiful. Because that's what Jericho was. It was the place where everybody went to get away from it all. You know, it was the Florida in Palestine. You went down into the Great Rift Valley, and you went to Jericho, the city of the palm trees, and that was a resort area. It still is today, as a matter of fact. I mean, there's no Jericho there now. There's a ruin of Jericho, but you know, if you go down to the Dead Sea, it's resort central. I mean, they've got motels, hotels, spas, you name it, all around the edge of the Dead Sea. And people go there to get away, to vacation. They have places where you can go and get in the water. It's a healing place because people go there to soak in the salts of the Dead Sea. So he had built up this palace, lavishly spent on this beautiful palace in Jericho for his own pleasure. Not only that, but he redirected the water of a village in that area to water his palm groves. So all the water that people in a village there were receiving from a stream, he redirected the stream so that his palm groves could have water. What a great guy. He built a small city and called it after his own name. Built it just out of nothing. and he married his brother's wife. I wonder if this is where Herod got it. Not the first time, won't be the last time. He married his brother's wife. And Josephus tells us, quote, "But in the 10th year of Archelaus' government, both his brethren and the principal men of Judah and Samaria, not being able to bear his barbarous and tyrannical usage of them, accused him before Caesar, and especially because they knew he had broken the commands of Caesar, which obliged him to behave himself with moderation among them." Well, if one thing could be said of Archelaus, it was that he was not moderate. He did not behave moderately amongst the people. So they accused him of barbarism and tyranny, and they accused him of this to Caesar. Now, all this is happening before we come to Luke 2:1. This is in the background of Luke 2:1. So let's begin now in Luke 2:1. "And it came to pass in those days." So all this is going on in those days. We have all this turmoil and upset. "That there went out a decree from Cæsar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And this taxing was first made when Cyrenius was governor of Syria." Now, I'm sure that Caesar thought that this was his idea. As a matter of fact, I'm sure that he thought that this was, and it was, this was just standard operating procedure for Rome. Because Archelaus had been so bad that Caesar now had to step in and clean up the mess. So Caesar was forced to clean up this mess. The story goes, this is according to Josephus, the story goes that he called in Archelaus' steward, who was over all Archelaus' house, all of his possessions, everything. He lived in Rome. Of course, he had to live in Rome because he had to give an account to Caesar for what Archelaus was doing. He called in the steward. He told the steward, Caesar was furious when he found out what was going on. He said to the steward, "You go and you bring him back." When the steward got to Palestine and walked into the palace that Archelaus had beautified, he found Archelaus feasting with his friends. Well, guess what happened? The feast stopped real quick. Archelaus was taken into custody and carried back to Rome to appear before Caesar. We don't know what happened to him, but we can imagine. It wasn't good. Well, actually, we do know what happened to him. He was exiled. He was exiled and sent someplace away from everyone. He was stripped of his titles, stripped of his house, stripped of all of his possessions. So now we have a void. And that void is going to be filled by this man that you have here in verse 2, Cyrenius. Cyrenius was a Roman senator who had worked his way up through the ranks and was at this time consul to Caesar. So Caesar takes Cyrenius and sends him to Judah, and he incorporates Judah and Samaria into the larger area of Syria, and so Cyrenius becomes the governor of Syria, which is over everything. And he sends with him a fellow by the name of, Coponius, who was a man of the equestrian order. And Josephus says of him that he was to have supreme power over the Jews. So here comes the hammer. He's going to come in and fix it for Caesar. And fixing it for Caesar means that he has to find out what Caesar has lost. Archelaus was a horrible administrator. He was a tyrant. He was killing people. He was ruining things. Caesar didn't want that because that caused upset. That caused people to revolt. So he sent Cyrenius and Coponius into Syria to find out how bad it was and what Caesar had lost. So they did a taxation. They're going to tax everybody just to make sure that Caesar hasn't lost anything by the foolishness of Archelaus. But that's the background. That's what's going on. And as I'm reading this, I'm thinking to myself, it's just like in our day, we get so caught up in the things that are going on in society, don't we? We get so caught up with the political things that are happening, with all the geopolitical moves that are being made in our day, and we're wondering what's going on, and it affects us. All of these things have an effect on us, the people who are paying the taxes. And so we get caught up in all that. Well, that same thing was happening in this day. And when you read the words, "and it came to pass in those days," well, they're reading the newspaper too. They're experiencing all all the effects that are happening from all these political machinations in their life and that are going on in the world. And Archelaus is gone, and here comes Cyrenius, and he comes with a new tax from Caesar, and everybody in Palestine, Syria, Judea, Samaria, they're all going to be taxed. And it says in verse 3, all went to be taxed, everyone into his own city. So at the beginning of the taxation, everybody's upset, which you can imagine. What if they told you that you're going to pay 10% more in your taxes? You're going to pay 10% more when you go to the grocery. You're going to pay 10% more on your income. You're going to, all of that. We would not be happy about that. These people were not happy about that at this time. They're very upset, but they relent. They realize what Archelaus has done and what Cyrenius was trying to do. And so they say, okay. Josephus even tells us that they gave an account of their estates without any dispute about it after their initial shock that they're going to now be taxed over this. However, there's always a however. There was a man by the name of Judas who led a revolt against the Roman taxation. Josephus reports that he said that this taxation was, quote, no better than an introduction to slavery, end quote. Because of their words and the actions against the Romans, it inspired lawlessness, it inspired robberies, and it inspired murders in Judea and in Samaria. Josephus tells us, quote, this was done in pretense, indeed for the public welfare, but in reality for the hopes of gain to themselves, whence arose seditions and from them murders of men. Not only were there seditions and murders and robberies and so forth, but whole towns and villages were burned to the ground because of these rebels who were rebelling against this taxation. And it wasn't about, freedom and liberty. That was the chant, I'm certain. But really what it was about was lining their own pockets. And so you've got Caesar who wants to make sure his pockets are nicely lined, and you've got Judas and his men who see an opportunity to line their pockets, and in between are the people, and all this violence and all of this upset and all of this fear about what's happening around them. And yet, in the middle of all of that, God is working. Sometimes we forget that, don't we? He knew long time ago that Archelaus was going to act a fool, and that Caesar was going to get mad, and that Cyrenius was going to come, and that Judas was going to have his revolt. God knew all of that. The Lord God has his hand on all of that and is using in the midst of all of this time the machinations of men and all of their sinfulness and all of their wickedness to advance his plan and to glorify himself. And so God is working in the midst of all of it. He moves the world when the world thinks that it's moving itself. And he also moves a man, because you'll notice there in verse 14, and Joseph, verse 4, and Joseph also. So God moves a man. We go from the big picture, Caesar and Archelaus and all these guys, down to some little guy in Nazareth that Caesar doesn't know, Archelaus doesn't know him, Judas doesn't know him, nobody knows little Joseph. He's just a carpenter there in Nazareth, in Galilee, and suddenly we find out about this man whom God moves. Joseph also went up from Galilee out of the city of Nazareth into Judea unto the city of David, which is called Bethlehem. Don't you love the little travelogue that we're given here? Galilee, the city of Nazareth. So it's like the state and the city. Galilee's the area, Nazareth is the city. He leaves there, he goes to Judea, which is the area, and to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem. So imagine a man moving his very pregnant wife. The Bible tells us she was great with child. You know what that means, ladies. This is not the first or second trimester. This is the third trimester. She's ready to give birth. You get down to the end and you're like, take this out of me, right? That's where Mary is. Imagine a man moving his very pregnant wife nearly 70 miles by foot or by cart or on the back of an animal, 70 miles. Now, if you're walking and you're a healthy person, you could probably walk about 12 to 14 miles a day, maybe 15. Now that's without a break. You just straight, right? And if you take breaks, which I'm sure Joseph did, it's probably less mileage than that. So she's going 70 miles. He and her are going 70 miles. That's probably going to take him a week to get there. Can you imagine that? That poor woman, she must have suffered the entire way, up and down the hills and the little crags and the bumps and all the rest. Oh, it must have been horrible for her. And who wouldn't you like to have the job to tell all the pregnant ladies in Nazareth, you got to leave and go back to your hometown? Oh, I wouldn't want that job. No, you know what that would be like. You mean I'm going to do what? Yeah. He did this, Joseph did this during, not only with a pregnant woman, his wife, who is going to have a very difficult time in such a long trip, but he did this during the dark days of rebellion, political turmoil, and upheaval in the country. Who knows who's going to come across the road as they travel? Could it be Judas's men who just want to rob everybody and take stuff and kill people? Could it be the Romans who think maybe that these are part of the rebel group? Who knows who's going to be there? Maybe it's just bandits along the road. The Romans are not there in force any longer because of Archelaus' foolishness. And now here they come with Coponius and all the rest. They don't know the people. This has got to be a scary time for Joseph, not only because of his wife's health, but because of what's going on. And he's got to go all the way south down to Bethlehem. Things were probably not that bad in Galilee where he lived, but he had to pass through and into Judah. Not going to be an easy trip. And you'll notice there it says in verse 4, because he was the house and the lineage of David. Matthew's gospel tells us all about that. If you want to turn right back to Matthew real quick, there in chapter 1, you'll find the house and lineage of David mentioned, beginning there in verse 6. I think it's verse 6. Yeah. So this is the genealogy of Christ, and we begin here in verse 6 with Jesse. Jesse begat David, the king. David, the king, begat Solomon, of her that had been the wife of Urias. And Solomon begat Rehoboam, and Rehoboam begat Abiah, and Abiah Asa, and Asa Jehoshaphat, and Jehoshaphat Joram, and so forth. And when we come all the way down here to verse 11? And Josias begat Jeconias and his brethren about the time they were carried away into Babylon. Okay, so now we have the captivity in Babylon. And then from there, we go down until we come to Joseph and his dad there in verse 16. Jacob begat Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus. So this is the lineage that Jesus is connected to all the way back to David. And of course, Matthew makes it very clear all the way back to Abraham. So we have this statement here in Luke chapter 2, which I think really is a nod that Luke gives to Matthew's telling of it. Don't forget that Jesus is of the house and lineage of David. Bethlehem is the city of David, of course. It's where David was anointed the very first time by Samuel. We remember that because we just read that not too long ago. It was where David shepherded those few sheep, as his brother called them. And we read about those times, of course, in 1 Samuel. So they're going back home. Joseph is a part of this heritage. This is his ancestral home, and that's where he's headed. And it says there in verse 5, to be taxed. Oh, that's a horrible reason to go. If you're going for Thanksgiving dinner, if you're going to visit family for Christmas, if you're going for, Mother's Day or Father's Day, those are wonderful times to go back home and see people. But this, they had to go so they could be taxed. And they're being taxed because of Archelaus' foolishness, because Cyrenius had come and laid down the hammer, and Coponius was doing his thing, making sure everybody did what they were supposed to do, and Caesar is mad back in Rome. And yet, God is moving a man into position so that the gospel will begin here, and so that the prophecies will be fulfilled. In the middle of all of this upset, a child is on the way. A child is on the way. Life, you know what, ladies and gentlemen, life doesn't pause for political calculations, natural disasters, war, or the foolishness of men. But God can and did use all of those things for his own glory. He certainly is sovereign over all of life. Down to the most tiny, minutest details, God is in charge of all of it. He's doing it for His own glory. How do you get a man and his pregnant wife to travel 70 miles back to their ancestral home? I don't know. God can, though, can't He? He took the foolishness of Archelaus and moved the heart of Cæsar and sent the man Cyrenius and stirred up the man Judas, all to position his son in David's city in the time for his birth and the fulfillment of prophecy. Wow. What a magnificent... His wonders are unsearchable, aren't they? Oh, my goodness. And then, not only did God move the world, not only did God move a man, but God moved a womb. Time marches on, because it says there in verse 6, and so it was that while they were there, the days were accomplished that she should be delivered. This wasn't a weekend trip. It took a long time to get there, and according to Matthew's gospel, they were there for possibly 2 years. I won't go there, but you can look at Matthew chapter 2, verses 11 through 18, the story of the Magi when they show up. And Herod kills all the children 2 years and younger because he asked the Magi what time the star appeared, so he knew approximately how old the boy was. I'm sure Mary would rather have been near her parents. Mindy mentioned that this morning when she sang. She would rather have been close to her grandmothers, close to her sisters, close to all of her family for the birth of her first child. But God's timing is always the best, and God's environment that He places us in is always the best, even if we don't think it is. Moments like this, you know what they do to us? They cause us to look to Him for support. Because when we're out of place, out of routine, out of sorts, and disconnected from the people we know and love, there's only one place we can look. Either we look inward or we look upward. And if we look inward, ladies and gentlemen, that leads to depression. That leads to despair. But if we look upward and we trust Him, who is in control of the smallest details of our life, nothing is going to be out of place because it's all really in His hands. He's the one in control of all of it. Life doesn't pause. Life doesn't pause. It marches on. Time marches on. And so she says there in verse 7, she brought forth her firstborn son. The very words of Christ said on the cross remind us of His birth. In Psalm 22, verses 9 through 11, we hear Jesus speaking, "But thou art He that took me out of the womb. Thou didst make me hope when I was upon my mother's breasts. I was cast upon thee from the womb. Thou art my God from my mother's belly. Be not far from me, for trouble is near, for there is none to help." There's only one help, only one. If we look to people, we find failure, but if we look to God, we always find help. Always look unto the hills, from whence cometh my help? My help cometh from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. They wrapped Him in swaddling clothes, it says. This is His badge of humanity. Right there in that manger scene after Mary delivers this child, and you can just imagine she has no place to have this baby. There's no fine cover. There's no nice bed. There's no fine clothing on the bed. There's nothing for her. There's just this manger where she's having this baby, this stable where she's having this baby. She wraps Him in swaddling clothes. Paul reminds us of the contradiction of swaddling clothes for one who was previously in the form of God, because it said that He found it not robbery to be equal with God, but made of Himself no reputation, took upon Him the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men. Well, here He is. And the same thing that was done to this baby boy on this day is the very same thing that's done to every baby born in every city around the world. You wrap them tight. This was His badge of humanity. He didn't need to be wrapped tight. He's the Lord of heaven. And yet, here He is, a tiny baby. And He's wrapped just like every other baby is wrapped tight. His badge of humanity is these swaddling clothes. And then we have the greatest contradiction of all. He's laid in a manger. The poverty of Christ is demonstrated even from the very beginning of his time among us. No reputation, the form of a servant, the likeness of men, being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself. Oh, what condescension, what great love. She laid him in a manger. And then the Bible tells us, or Luke tells us right here in chapter 2, it's because there was no room for them in the inn. It wasn't that the innkeeper was a mean guy. He wasn't a mean fellow. I'm sure he wasn't. I don't know what he was, but he didn't just turn this pregnant woman away because he wanted to see a pregnant woman suffer. He turned her away because he didn't have another room. He gave her the stable to have the child in and the manger to lay the baby in. Just imagine that. He was out of rooms. Both my mother's family, and my father's family are from Butler and Grayson counties in Kentucky, and that's western Kentucky. The little town close to where they lived is called Caneyville. Caneyville is just a little burg. Back in the day, when I was a boy, it was a happening place. They had a diner. They had an IGA grocery store, which was the finest grocery store in the world, in my opinion. They had a hardware store, which was the finest hardware store. You could find stuff in there dating back to the 17th century, I think. They had everything you could ever. They had a school right there. There was a lumber mill in Caneyville, Kentucky, a bank in Caneyville, Kentucky. I mean, they had everything you'd want in Caneyville, Kentucky. It was just a little bitty place. One crossroads and a stoplight. Well, the stoplight's gone now, and now it's just a flashing red light. The hardware's gone. The grocery's gone. To my great disappointment, the hardware is gone. The diner is gone. The bank is no longer there. The school's not even there. The only thing that's in Caneyville now is the funeral home. That's about it in Caneyville, Kentucky. But if I was called to go back to the place of my ancestral heritage, that's where I would go back. I would go back to Caneyville, Kentucky. All of my male cousins would have to go back there, and all the people with any family history that had ever lived there would have to go back to Caneyville, Kentucky. Now, what would happen to that little sleepy hamlet called Caneyville when everybody had to go back there? It would be bursting with people. There would be no way. There could be no way. And there's no way they would be ever ready for the influx. People will be standing around looking for a place to stay. They could stay in the basement of the Methodist church, in the basement of the Baptist church maybe. They could stay here and there, but all the people that would have to go back there, that's a lot of people. And can you imagine, Bethlehem's just a sleepy little place south of Jerusalem, and all of a sudden, all of these people show up because of Caesar's order, and the place just bursts at the seams with folk that have come back. Now, maybe it was a happy scene. Maybe they've seen people that they hadn't seen in a long time. But for Joseph, can't you imagine the burden that's on him? He's worried about this pregnant woman who's about to deliver, and he doesn't have a place to stay. But I think there's more to be understood here than just the fact that the inn was full and that there were people everywhere. I think what we need to see here is that men's hearts are so filled with the vanities of the world that they are practiced at rejecting him. The conclusion then, what can the Lord God do during a global pandemic? Is he still in charge when men seem to go mad? Well, number one, the Lord does not stop his work because of man's foolishness. The hand of the Lord uses tyranny, the tyranny of Archelaus, the greed and the pride of Caesar, the bitterness of Judas, to glorify himself in the birth of his son. He uses all of it. He's not stopped moving among men. He's still sovereign, ladies and gentlemen. This is still his world, his program. Holiness, righteousness, and faithfulness is not stayed or stained by the wickedness of men. But what about now? What about now? Not only does he shepherd the world in such a way, but he oversees the life of one man, one wife, and one child. He is the shepherd of this family. The Lord is my shepherd, David said. I shall not want. He leads me the paths of righteousness. He leads me beside the still waters. He causes me to lie down in the grassy pastures. He restores my soul. See, this is what he does. And he's leading even one man, one woman, one child. And he does it in the midst of a world on fire. What about you? Can you trust him to shepherd you through the valley of the shadow of death? And then the humble child, he comes demanding nothing, although he could have. He comes demanding nothing but room in an inn, and he's rejected even there and given a manger to lie in, a feeding trough for animals. There was no room in the inn for Jesus, but ladies and gentlemen, I think the larger question is there room in your heart for Christ? Or is your heart so full of stuff, worries, plans, COVID fear, and fear of the risks of life that there is no room for him? Tear down, ladies and gentlemen. Pull out. Make room, because he comes bringing peace.
Jesus will meet you.
Thanks for listening to this week's message. Please join us again next time for another installment of the Creek Road Baptist Pulpit.